this week's show, our guest is John Dominic Crossan, our featured guest. We've had him several times on our show, and we have a special series that we've been working on. At first, it was called the Real Jesus, a Historical Reconstruction. Then we changed it to Jesus the Israelite, because with my interest in Jewish studies, we are looking at the Jewish background of Jesus, and the issue that keeps coming up is anti-Semitism, either modern from the Middle Ages or ancient and Christian anti-Semitism. So when I've had this book for years, and I pulled it up from my bookshelf, and I hadn't realized that it talks about the roots of anti-Semitism and the passion narrative of Jesus. And it's just an amazing book. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote it, and what was the impetus to get that message out?
Let me go way back. After I got my doctorate, this would be in 59. I went to Rome for 2 years. That was 59 to 61. I was a priest at the time, a member of a monastic order. And I was at the Biblical Institute, and one of my main professors was Cardinal Bea. He was becoming a cardinal because he was very interested in the Second Vatican Council and in the relation and rethinking the relationship between especially Catholicism and Judaism, and how maybe anti-Jewish sentiment had been the seedbed for anti-Semitism. So I started being very interested in this in 1959 to 61. And then as a priest, I took 40 people to Oberammergau, the Passion Play, in 1960, the second time since the war. In 1950, it was there with Adenauer and Eisenhower. So I was basically seeing the play that Hitler had seen in 1933 and no, in 1930, sorry, and again in 34, I think it was. So I was seeing it, and what struck me immediately I did know the story and I knew how it ended, but when I saw it as a play on a stage, it didn't make any sense to me, because all the people were shouting for Jesus at 9 o'clock in the morning. This is what we call Palm Sunday. And by 3 to 4 in the afternoon, they were all shouting against Jesus. So there was something wrong. Now you get the same people on the stage, and it was a huge stage, so it was filled with people. And so why were all the people for him on Palm Sunday, to use our terminology, and against him on Good Friday? Were we dealing with different crowds? So I got interested in that in terms of historicity. That was my approach. I figured the best way to handle anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is not by so much talking about it as by doing good history. And if you do good history, that cauterizes that longest lie. Because we've been living, with lies, both in religion and politics, for quite some time. So that's how it all got started. Now, the book itself, I wrote it in, I think, the summer. It came out in 95, I think, and I wrote it in 3 months in kind of nonstop. I asked my publishers, if I get this out, can you publish it fast? And they said yes, because I thought it was necessary to raise the issue in terms of good history. I was not the least bit interested in a cover-up or anything else. Josephus, the Jewish historian, gives the best summary, actually, when he says that the first men among us, that means the high priest, turn him over to Pilate. That's, I think, the best way to summarize it. But the high priests no more represent the Jewish people or the Jews than the fact that Pilate executed them should make us turn against the Romans or the Italians, whichever way. So good history tells you who did what, why they did it, and then you can ask, why is that justified to turn against people or any people for 2,000 years? So that's what I was interested in.
Well, let's talk about your methodology, because when we look at the records that are out there, and now we have a push from the atheist community saying that it's all made up stuff, that he never even existed. When you look at you mentioned Josephus, we have other authors who spoke about the Jesus movement, or what you call it, the kingdom movement. But we have these texts that we're all familiar with, the Gospels. But you bring in three other Gospels that, two of them that I wasn't familiar with. So we have the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, and then the Gospel of the Cross, or is that part of the Gospel of Peter?
It's really part of the Gospel of Peter. It's like a source within the Gospel of Peter. To be honest with you, there is no serious historian that, well, I shouldn't say no serious historian, but let me put it this way. The majority of scholars, the vast majority of scholars, admit that there is a consensus that Jesus existed. Not a miracle, because it almost never happens. But of course, you can always argue the negative, and I would have great difficulty if somebody wanted to argue with me that Jesus never existed, because everything I could bring up, they could argue, well, that's just part of the big lie, as it were, the fake. It's like somebody arguing the Holocaust didn't exist, and then every text you bring up and every evidence and everything, well, that's just part of the fake, you know. So basically, as a historian, not as a theologian and not as a Christian, I am absolutely convinced that Jesus was executed. And furthermore, to look at the two most important outsiders, Josephus in the 90s of the first century, and Tacitus, Roman historian, in the first decades of the second century, what they're doing is trying to explain who these weirdo Christians are. I mean, they're not interested in Jesus, really. Who are Christians? And they're trying to tell people, well, Christians are kind of like, you know, Platonists follow Plato, Aristotelians follow Aristotle, Christians follow Christ. Okay, who's Christ? Well, he was a guy over there in Judea who started a movement. So tell us four things. He started a movement. We executed him for it. And they're almost surprised the movement continued. They explain why the movement continued. Josephus does it kind of politely by saying, well, those who were loyal to him before continue to be loyal and love him afterwards. And Tacitus, who has a permanent sneer on his face, and writes with a sneer in his pen, as it were, says, well, it was an infection. And infections tend to spread. And everything rotten comes to Rome eventually. So, but both of them had to admit that the execution of the founder of this movement just didn't work for us. So I take that as very serious testimony from one person who's kind of polite about it, and the other person who thinks it's just an infection. So from a historical point of view, I would start with that as a fact. Then you can raise the issues, why it happened and all the rest of it, but I start with it as a fact.
Well, I heard recently someone say that Paul was the main pusher for this this idea of the Christ, and then his followers went ahead and wrote about what he was pushing to make sure that there was a record of it. It's almost like the idea that when the temple was destroyed, the new Sanhedrin in Yavne wrote the Mishnah and then the Talmud to be able to conceal or keep the traditions that they were being
I've
lost.
lost you completely.
The followers of Paul went back in time and they try to reconstruct the life of Jesus to help push the traditions that have been going around, just like the new Sanhedrin in Yavne wrote the Mishnah to be able to keep the traditions around the temple and Judaism. Do you think that that would be an accurate portrayal of what happened?
Yeah, a little oversimplified. And by the way, I would be willing to say, with all due respect to atheists, you're not excused by atheism from doing good history, and neither are you excused from faith from doing good history. Both people have to do good history first. Then you're perfectly free to say, I don't believe in the interpretation. Or somebody else can say, I don't believe, I accept the interpretation. But an interpretation of an historical event, as we know at the moment, there can be an historical event and some people don't even think it happened and some people do. That's interpretation. That's all right. We were discussing the fact. Now, of course, we are dealing with, in the gospel versions, for example, we're dealing with not just history, though it contains it, not just biography. we're really dealing with confessional treatises. They call themselves openly and honest, the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They don't even say the history of Jesus. They never use that term, or biography of Jesus. They admit, we're telling you this is good news. Now, good news, I don't think you have to tell people today in our country, the good news depends upon your viewpoint. What is good news to me might not be good news to you. So good news is a viewpoint, or if you will, it's an interpretation. And those of us who work with the historical Jesus try to look at that figure that was there open to interpretation. If somebody else thinks he's divine, that's another interpretation. So you try to focus on the fact, and then a good historical explanation would have to say, why did some people think this guy was a criminal and should be crucified? And some people think he was divine and should be worshipped. I mean, how did people come up with that S about the same person, if you will? So that's what's different.
So going to the issue of anti-Judaism, to me, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are the same thing because it involves the hatred of Jews or the hatred of the religion of the Jews. But to look at the Gospels, including the ones that, that you bring in, such as the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas, you see a progression. You see, you have a very interesting chart on your book that you have in the Gospel of Peter. You have some people involved, but not everybody's culpable. And then it builds up all the way to everybody's culpable. And I was surprised, it's something that I always knew, but I hadn't realized that in the book of Acts, it blasts all Jewish people as being the killers of the author of life. This progression, there's another theory that has been brought up that somehow the Gospels are a pro-Roman treatise. That it made me think that after the destruction of the temple, there was so much animus against the rebels and the people who were pushing for Jewish independence. Is it possible that some of these diatribes and almost like a versus Judea style, confrontation against the Jewish people, that it comes from the sense of like, we want to distance ourselves from the rebels and the zealots, and we want to create some type of attack versus these people who are very nationalistic, and create this more universal religion that Jesus, even in your book, you say he never pushed for the, other than maybe later, as is interpreted, for going onto the nations and spreading it to the pagans, that somehow his Jewish mission was reframed to make it a more universal Roman religion.
Okay, let me take that very carefully, because we're zooming across the decades and even the first 2 centuries here. First of all, let me be very blunt. Anti-Judaism is not the same as theological anti-Judaism, which is bad, by the way, but it's not the same as racial anti-Semitism. Racial anti-Semitism, as we know from the Holocaust, it didn't make any difference if you converted or anything else and became a Christian. That's bad, but it's racially based. What you're dealing with in the New Testament is competition, nasty competition, by the way, of course, between groups who are elbowing one another, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Christians, call them the Messianists, if you will. They're all Jews, by the way. Every one of them is a Jew. None of them is thinking of starting a new religion, but they are arguing with one another in the cauldron of Ramadan. They're saying nasty things about one another, and Josephus says kind of nasty things about them all. So that's the cauldron we're dealing with. Now, for example, if you look at Mark, Mark is considered to be a major source used by Matthew and Luke. You know that as well as I do. I would hope all your audience does too. Therefore, we can look at what Mark says and watch what Matthew does to it, for example. And we know then Mark came first because we're watching a source. Mark talks about a situation where a crowd go up to Pilate to ask for the Paschal amnesty for their hero Barabbas, who the Romans would call a brigand, a lestes in Greek, a brigand, and probably from his Jewish people, they call him a freedom fighter. They come up to ask for him out. Give us Barabbas out. Now, think historically, realistically. How many people do you think would be in that crowd that went up to Pilate to ask for the freedom for a condemned person who's in jail for treason against Rome? I was going to say, if I'm advising, say, if I was advising Mel Gibson in his movie, I would say don't push it beyond 6 to 10 people. That's a crowd. It's like if you and I talked about two's company, three's a crowd, or there was a crowd of senators with the president in the Oval Office. How many are we imagining? 10, maybe 20. So I'm imagining they're going up to get Barabbas, that crowd. It's a singular, achlos in Greek, crowd, and you have to judge how many we're talking about by the situation. All right, now, watch what Matthew does when he's copying Mark and changing him. The first time he mentions it, it's a crowd. Next time it's crowds, achla in Greek, plural. And then finally he says all the people. And the people is called the solemn word laos, not just a crowd. So you can watch Matthew change Mark and escalate the Jewish responsibility for not all the Jews, but the crowd in Jerusalem. It is escalating. It is definitely escalating. Let me turn to the other side. This idea that Pilate is like a Hamlet figure, he just can't make up his mind, the poor guy. Then he washes his hands, but turns Jesus over to his soldiers. All of that is not pro-Roman. It's absolutely mocking. It's Saturday Night Live about a Roman governor. Any Roman governor that the crowd dictate his judgment would be impeached. Their justice. And the idea that the crowd shouting at him would have dictated which way he went would be mocking him. But of course, they have to admit at the end, Pilate has him crucified. Nobody else can run a crucifixion except the governor. So it's not pro-Roman at the beginning. It will get pro-Roman. I think by the time you get to Luke, for example, it's much more pro-Roman, much more. The culpability, if you will, is starting to shift from the Romans to the Jews. That is happening. But now again, don't make it happen too fast, because it doesn't. But it does. I think it is caused, I think you're quite right, that after the first war with Rome, 66 to 74, and then maybe the second one across North Africa in 115, 117, yeah, I think the animosity in the Roman Empire to the Jews was increasing. Though to be fair, they never made it a forbidden religion or anything like that. And I think if you are writing Christian gospel, what you're thinking of, who we're having most trouble with? We're having most trouble with our fellow Jews. So if I'm in an experience that my fellow Jews are pushing me out of the synagogue, they're my enemies. And when I rewrite the story of Jesus, wow, they're his enemies too. So a lot of the later and more intensive animosity is put back into the 30s, where it probably wasn't there in the 30s, but it was there after the 70s.
And with there are controversial texts such as the Gospel of Thomas. Do you believe that it has multiple layers, that it has like a Jewish base to it, and then a more Greek or Hellenized segments to it, and then it becomes more Gnostic as it goes? Or do you believe that it is all original to first century Judaism?
No. First of all, I don't think the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic in any meaning of that word. But the Gospel of Thomas is what I would call encretite. It is in favor of sexual abstinence. The Gospel of Thomas's idea is that everything went wrong in the Garden of Eden when we had two. if we could get back to that moment where its terminology is when we make the two one. And the way you make the two one is refusing to be male or female, as it were. It's basically, let me put it this way. It's almost inventing monasticism. It's really Greek at all. I think it's something that is known in the Jewish tradition as well down at Qumran, which is, I'm going to call it a monastic community, unless that's offensive because it might be seen a Christian word. But the first person who ever used the word monaikos, from whom we get monastic, was Philo. He knew about such people near Alexandria or south of Alexandria. So there was within the Jewish tradition, forget Christianity completely, a segment that, how would I put it? We're so disenchanted with this world that they had withdrawn from it into the desert usually, and we're living celibate lives. So Thomas is about celibacy, sorry. I don't think it's Gnostic at all. And I don't think it's Greek either. That's a very un-Greek idea.
And back to the original words of Jesus, I know in our conversation about the Jesus seminar and the way you guys went about trying to decipher what was historical and what wasn't, do you think that you know, maybe percentage-wise, in the Gospel of Peter, in the Gospel of Thomas, and in the Synoptic and the Gospel of John, how much Jesus do we have left versus all this theological positions? And clearly it's almost like people are making a lot of assumptions and working out their theology within themselves.
Okay, the first thing you have to do, sorry to say it again, is get your history right, because theology is simply an interpretation of history. That's all it is. I mean, you can say, I listen to your theology. I may say it's a good interpretation, it's a bad interpretation. Let me repeat. I mean, we're getting a basic lesson in this in current politics in this country. There are people looking at a fact, and some people saying it didn't happen. Biden isn't the president. That's no more extraordinary to me than saying Jesus never existed. People have done this. It's just that we're getting a very example of it at the moment. Thomas, for example, that you mentioned, doesn't have any story of the crucifixion. So that doesn't help us really at all. It helps us maybe with the sayings of Jesus, but it doesn't help us with that because it doesn't have an account of the crucifixion. So I know I'm repeating myself, but if you do good history and put it back in the first century, in the 30s of the first century, the background is the initial Romanization of Israel. And that's what they're working on, what I'm going to call Mediterranean globalization. This tiny piece of the Levantine coast that we call Israel, to be honest with you, not of any great importance, except it's a link between Syria to the north, Egypt to the south. It's the linkage of this pan-Mediterranean globalization. Now, that's what's going on. Along comes Jesus. In that matrix, there are Essene Jews, there are Pharisaic Jews, there are Sadducean Jews, and now there's a new group. I'm going to call them Messianic Jews. They're either hoping for the Messiah to come now, because we're waiting for him for, 500 years we've been hearing he's coming, and now we got the Romans. We got the strongest empire the world has ever known. Where's the Messiah? So let's call them Messianic Jews. They're expecting closely the Messiah. Now, maybe some of them think of Jesus, maybe they don't. But that's the fourth category of Jew. It has nothing to do, to put it bluntly, with later Gentile Christianity. That's separate. 4 groups. By the end of the century, 100 years later, the Essenes will be gone. The Sadducees will be gone from history. The 2 groups left would be Pharisaic Jews and Messianic Jews. And they're both in a way, and have always been, fighting to control the center of their people. They're all Jews. Now, eventually, what's going to happen is those missionaries, if you will, who go out into the diaspora of Judaism will eventually become Gentiles, and we'll have what we call Christianity. Not Messianic Judaism, but Christianity. But it'll take a long, slow process. When you could say it was done definitively, well, I'm going to say it was done definitively when Constantine in the 300s threw his favor behind Christianity. Up to that point, I'm not convinced it could have, I am convinced it could have gone either way, we put it that way. So what really happened is all of this nasty things that people were saying one another. And you know what Messianic Jews were saying about Pharisaic Jews, we have a good record of it. They were probably saying equally nasty things. This is a political, religio-political infighting within the same family. It's much worse within the same family. By 100 years later, it's still going on. But I would say the definitive break came at the moment that Constantine said, I find Christianity kingdom. 325, if you.
I want to get to the crux of your book, and you share how a lot of the passages from King David, from the Psalms, from the life of different prophets were interpolated into the life of Jesus. But there's a key passage that that is brought up, and you say that there's different accusations against Jesus during his trials, and you do a good job at showing how it went from one trial to 3 to 1.5, depending on who's portraying it. So there's this accusation of destroy the temple and I will raise it back in 3 days, and that could have been an allegorical thing. It could have been just a way of pointing to his future torturous death and resurrection. But what happens there where it goes from just talking about what they consider to be a heretical or very arrogant claim, and then all the way to being accused of calling himself the Son of God, that is almost like an avenger of God on earth, then all the way to, there's a couple of new books, the Jewish Gospel of John and the Jewish Gospels by Daniel Boyarin, and they all say that from the beginning there was already within Judaism this idea of a divine Messiah, and that Jesus was just saying what everybody believed up to that point, that it wasn't developed at the time. And I wonder if some of that was in Mark when he says, you will see me in the clouds of heaven. But they built this whole premise that all these ideas were already going around. In your perspective, was it more like a political issue? And if you question the temple, you're questioning the center of authority and the people who are in authority. Is that really what the original conflict was? And then it got built theologically to be more than that?
Okay, if I could look at it historically for a moment. When the Romans took over a place, they worked usually in the beginning with what we would call puppet rulers. They would call them client rulers. They didn't just arrive in, dump everyone out and say, we're now in charge, we have a Roman governor. That took time. So what they had to deal with in Israel was a high priest. Now that's something brand new. They're a temple state. If I'm a governor and I'm in Ephesus, I deal with the richest man in Ephesus. That's my liaison, if you will. I can't hire and fire him. I can't. Now, a high priest were hired and fired during the first century. For the first 100 years was rotten. I don't mean corrupt in the sense. I mean, it was rotten. They couldn't decide who was in charge. If I'm a governor and I can fire and hire the person I'm dealing with as the representative of the people, that's not going to work. No wonder it didn't work for the Romans. No wonder there was so much trouble. So basically, the high priests we shouldn't think of them as being, well, these represent the Jews. They represent the Jews, if I could be very blunt, in much the same way as certain French people represented their people during the Second World War. You could call them quislings if you wanted to. And the proof of that is that in the year 70, when the Romans had ringed around Jerusalem and all the fighters were inside Jerusalem, one of the first things they started doing was killing the high priests. You think they'd be more interested in getting their organizations ready for the Roman siege? No. The first thing they did was go after their high priests. So the first thing you have to know is that the Jewish high priests in the first century were very, very uneven representatives from their own people. Not because they were priests or not because they were evil or anything else. They just had the job of trying to placate the Romans, and placated them more than they placated their own people. And the reason they did that, as I said, was it could be hired and fired. That's not the way the Romans ran any of their other provinces. You can't do that. This was a temple state. So that created a problem. Now, when Jesus, for example, we talk about cleansing the temple, he didn't. What he did was shut it down. What he did was turn over the fiscal basis of it in the perfectly valid changing of money to make your temple offering in the court of the Gentiles. There was nothing wrong with it. But it was a symbolic act to close down the temple. Now, if we translate that as being against the temple, against the Jews, against the priesthood, all of that is rubbish. What he is against is the collaboration between the representatives of God in the house of God and the Roman rulers. And they would say, as they would have said, well, we have to do it. If we don't do it, who's going to collaborate? There'll be riots and the Romans will kill you all. So it has nothing to do with anti-Judaism. It does have to do with the tension between ordinary people and the representatives of their own people who are placating the occupiers. That's the scenario that's going on. And if you take that history out of it, then it makes no sense. Or just a nice guy like Jesus and these evil people kill him. And it's all rubbish.
Well, and that's what you see in the Gospel of John, where it's almost like the murder of Jesus. Everybody's conspiring to destroy him. And that's, I think, where you would get the idea that they were in league with Satan, because Satan is trying to destroy the work of God. So it's not blatant anti-Judaism, but it becomes because you start associating people with that. But theologically speaking, I know you're a historian, but you also have the religious background. What do you think is the relationship between the figure of Jesus as a divine Son of God and the figure of Enoch, and how he was built up to be a divine messenger or even judge in the court of God in the book of Enoch? Because if you look at that, how he became, there are passages in the New Testament that show that Jesus becomes the first of all creation, or a brother to the resurrected, or he becomes the person who represents all people before God. And it has like that role, and it says that he was glorified in some passages in Paul as compared to this idea that he was divine to begin with. Do you see some correlation in Enochic Judaism and theology with the theology that we're building around Jesus?
Yes, and by the way, I am both an historian and a theologian, because the historical Jesus was a theologian. So if somebody doesn't like theology, stay away from the historical Jesus. You know what I mean? It's like if you're going to try and talk about Aeschylus and you hate medicine, don't do it. Jesus himself is not just talking about history, he's making theological claims. So as a historian, I will have to say Jesus makes this historical claim. Then as a Christian, I can say I agree with it or I disagree with it. That's fine. And you can say the same. What we cannot historically do is say, well, Jesus was just kind of trying to be a nice guy, as I said, and patting little babies, and these evil people killed him. No, no. Jesus was executed for nonviolent resistance to Roman law and order. The Romans, from their point of view, got it precisely right. So did Pilate. But notice he didn't round up his followers. By Roman law, a violent revolutionary, you grab them all with their followers, put them in a nice row so people get the message. For Romans, a nonviolent revolutionary is executed alone. Because after all, Tacitus are so surprised. So it's always been with the history. If I knew nothing about Enoch, all of that are the logical layers that are built on Jesus, I would know this. Now, let me be very clear. If Jesus never existed, and before he ever existed, there was a human being in the Mediterranean world, I'm talking about Caesar the Augustus, of course, who was considered Son of God, divine, pretty much God incarnate, you would call him the God, Lord, Savior of the world. These are all titles, Redeemer from sin even. All of that was there from Caesar Augustus. So we're living in a climate, whether we like it or not, and our post-Enlightenment minds don't like calling human beings divine, because how could a human being be divine? Well, take it up with the Romans. And if you don't do it with the Romans, take it up with the Greek. They considered that any human being, talking about a human being, stick a pin in them, he goes out, a human being who had done something of extraordinary value for the human race, in our judgment, extraordinary value for the human race, like inventing medicine, would be considered divine because they had revealed the nature of God. That's their language. We might say, give the guy a Nobel Prize or something. They'd say he's divine. Now, they meant something by that. They meant that this person has revealed something of the nature of the divine, of the gods. So Hercules, for example, who goes around and he's a strong man, he's always helping people. That shows the gods are on our side. So he's divine. And when he dies, he's taken up to the gods. Now, I don't take that for a second, literally. Not for them, not for anyone else, ever. But I understand in their language, which I do respect, transculturally, in their language, when they tell me, for example, that Augustus is divine, they're telling me this guy did something of magnificent value for the human race. Okay, what did he do? He brought us peace after 20 years of savage civil war that almost destroyed the Roman Empire. Okay, I got it. I got it. Now, we got another guy over here who's a Jewish peasant. And there's some weird people claiming that he has all those titles I just used. Divine, Son of God, God incarnate. This must be some kind of an opposition to Caesar. You're claiming Jesus is divine. We're claiming Caesar is divine. Nobody in the first century could say you can't do that, because that's what everyone does. But they could say, our guy has done more for the human race than your guy. So when we hear Son of God and people get to have a council at Nicaea to try and figure out how Jesus could be human and divine, the Romans would have laughed. First century Romans, I mean, because they said, Caesar is divine, and if you don't understand it, dear Greeks, we'll send the legions to explain it to you. We don't need a council, we have the legions. So the lack of history is what's appalling, that people think all of these titles of Jesus, how can he be Son of God? We'll have to go and find. All of those layers of theology are going to be put on him. But the surprise is that they're put on a Jewish peasant. They're taken from the Roman emperor, give it to a Jewish peasant. That's the challenge. If we don't face that, we're asking like how did Jesus become God? Well, first of all, forget that and ask, how did Caesar become God? Then what's the parallel? So that's what's going on. And all the other stuff is right. You're quite right. You mentioned, for example, the crucifixion of Jesus is a tissue of resonances from the Old Testament sufferings in the Psalms, which means that the people who wrote that are not trying to talk about Jesus's execution as this unique thing up on top of a hill with the whole world watching. He is, first of all, one more Jew. Okay, he's a Messianic Jew, and he's dying the same way as Jews have died for hundreds of years. So that tissue, they're not proofs so much. That'll come later. They're saying, how do we describe the death of our Jesus? We don't know anything. He died on the Roman cross. That's all we know. We know crucifixions. Well, he died by saying this. The last words were that. He's surrounded by a tissue, a cloud like of his own people who have died. All of that's terribly important, but it's nothing to do with as if you were standing in Golgotha, would you have heard Jesus say, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they do? No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. Luke created that. Nor would you hear Jesus saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But all of those are interpretations of the death of Jesus. They're not bad history. They're good interpretations, and you have to decide which one is more important.
One really striking part of your book is when you show the difference between him being given wine, vinegar, gall, all in the same situation, and how it relates to being poisoned or being or him being in control and drinking the last cup, or it being done with hyssop. It's amazing how you know, in the literalism of fundamentalist Christians or even fundamentalist Jews, they get mad when things don't fit perfectly, and they'll say these guys were making stuff up as they went, or they were, you know, lying or something like that, without taking consideration is like, this is a book of suffering, just like the Torah is a book of suffering during the exile that is being implanted into the previous experiences. So when you're suffering and you're mourning someone you love, you come up with things that help you process the experience. And then to connect them with the ancient prophets and their challenges, and how every single item has a special purpose. It's beautiful, but it's also kind of disturbing to see that the same situation was interpreted in so many different ways and portrayed in so many different ways, and now people cling to it and they claim that it all fits together when they're actually all distinct and separate.
No, once you realize that, I think you have a fact, Jesus was crucified. I'm considering that a fact. Now, if a Roman was watching, he probably would have said, another good day's work for Roman law and order. one more renegade, got his comeuppance. A Jew passing by who didn't know anything about it might say, another poor Jew on a Roman cross, what else is new? Everyone is interpreting a fact. That doesn't make any of them wrong. It makes some of them viable maybe for 2,000 years and some of them not viable for 2,000 years. So I think, for example, if you took Mark's gospel and John's gospel, take Mark's gospel and give an assignment, write me Mark's gospel, but put Jesus in charge of the whole operation. What you'd get is John's gospel. That's exactly what happens. Mark, for example, they mock him, they give him the wine and whatever it is. Let's keep him alive for a few more minutes to see if Elijah comes. He's called on Elijah. Oh, let's keep him alive to see if Elijah comes. They're mocking him. The same thing when it happens in John. Jesus asks for it to fulfill the scriptures. And then when that happens afterwards, it's like Jesus looks around, you can almost see him thinking, okay, now I've fulfilled everything. I think I'll go. So Jesus is in total control, actually. Even Pilate is almost like a puppet in John. That's a different interpretation. Is it wrong? No, because actually, in terms of 2,000 years, Jesus is still around. The Pilate's only home because he executed. The challenge, of course, is which of these interpretations do you, if you find any of them, valid for your life? So a real first century challenge is not like we might be doing, did he say this, did he say that? That's a different question. It's perfectly valid. But the first century question is, do you think Caesar or Jesus is the Son of God? That, by the way, could get you killed in the first century. Because to say Jesus is and Caesar isn't is high treason, which is why some of these people have an unnerving habit of getting killed. If you simply said Jesus was divine, the Romans couldn't care. We all have our little divinities, our little lords, everyone, just don't say he's the Lord or the Son of God. So what you have is a religio-political, I don't want to say religious, it's not religious. It's religio-political. It's what's the meaning of the world type question. And if you take it out of history, again, repeat myself, you take it out of history, it makes no sense. It's all theological gobbledygook, actually. Once you have a firm historical basis, you can begin to say, why would they have said that when Jesus was dying, they offered him wine and things like that? Why was that invented? Because, by the way, it was invented. So I will never say anything was invented, and I say an awful lot was invented, without asking, why did an author do that? For example, if in Luke, and only in Luke, I find out that Jesus is sent from Pilate to Herod Antipas to be checked out. I don't think that happened, by the way. But I want to know, why exactly did Luke do that? And Luke, who is massively exculpating the Romans, is saying that, well, every Roman official said he was innocent. Pilate thought he was innocent. Antipas thought he was innocent. The centurion at the cross thought he was innocent. Same thing will happen to Paul. So everything that's put in, if you want to say invented, you have to be able to say, to be credible, why did they do that? And you don't ever conclude, at least I would never conclude from the interpretations, multiple interpretations, that something didn't happen, any more than I conclude from all the interpretations of what happened on, say, January the 6th at the Capitol building, that nothing must have happened, because I've seen all sorts of interpretations of it. So nothing must have happened. No, something happened, and you may have to decide yourself which one you think is more valid.
Well, let's talk about the historicity of his death the night before Passover. And then this idea, like if you watch Mel Gibson's film, as you mentioned, you have the priest going on a donkey to the Mount Golgotha and watching Jesus die, making sure that he's done. I had forgotten that in the book of Mark, it actually says that they're there. And that's one of the earliest sources, and it's saying something that most anti-missionaries and people that have issues with Christianity would say would be impossible. One time in a class, I said, well, it's only impossible if you don't believe that they're corrupt. If they're corrupt and they're trying to get rid of him, wouldn't they want to be there to make sure that it happened? And or is that also a creative way to depict his enemies mocking him?
All right. I don't think I've ever used in 50 years of writing the term corruption. They are collaborating with the Romans. That's what they're doing. The one time in John, where they do say that he's a danger, they'll bring the Romans down on him. That's a perfectly valid problem. Remember again, the function of the high priest is to collaborate with the Romans. The fact that Pilate and Caiaphas did it maybe too well is proved by the fact that in 36, the Syrian legate dumped both of them out of office, both of them, both Pilate and Caiaphas, because your job as a high priest is to collaborate with the Romans. Your job is also not having your people rebel against you. So you're on a knife edge. Of course, we call these people collaborators. That's a proper term for them. You can have good collaborators, you can have bad collaborators. Bad collaborators, we probably go too much in favor of one or the other. So They're not corrupt. I don't think for a second. Let me go back to Mark. What was it? Chapter 14. What has happened? What has been happening is the crowds have been on Jesus' side. The high priest decided it's too dangerous to move against him because there may be a riot among the people, unless we can get him by stealth. That's their, I think, perfectly right decision. It makes sense. Jesus has been going back to Bethany every night. He's leaving the city, so it's very hard to get him during the day because the crowds are on his side. So I just think this person is dangerous. I believe sincerely he's dangerous. He's stirring up the crowd, and there's going to be a whole crowd in the temple, tightly packed, celebrating freedom from Egypt, while soldiers are looking down from the Fortress Antonia under Rome. Two riots that we know of during Passover, one I think in 4 BCE, the other in the 50s. Thousands killed. If I'm the high priest, my corruption is collaboration, of course, but I can be utterly sincere in thinking Jesus is dangerous. He is dangerous. He's dangerous to Roman law and order. The trouble is that Roman law and order didn't know how to handle him. So they thought execution would solve it. That was, I'm going to repeat myself, a good judgment by Pilate from Roman law and order standard, because that's what they did with nonviolent revolutionaries. But it didn't work. Now, if we are interested in doing good history, we have to do it with regard to the Romans. We have to do it with regard to high priestly collaborators. And we have to recognize that if the Romans fired Caiaphas, which they did, and fired Pilate around the same time, 36, 37, that from the Roman point of view, that is from the governor in Syria who was in charge, something was gone wrong with the collaboration. So that's the history that we have to be watching. And whether we're dealing with fervent Christians, fundamentalist Christians, or atheists, neither, I'm going to say bluntly, neither is excused from doing good history. And both of them, in my view, should do history first and then get to theology. If you start with theology, you probably will never get to good history. So you almost have to leave it out of your mind for a while. And say, let me just look at the Roman Empire and try and understand what's going on. It's almost like a discipline. Let me try and imagine. You can't do it, I know. Jesus didn't exist. Now, part of what helps me, I suppose, is that I went to a classical boarding school, so I spent 5 years of Greek and Latin before I ever read the New Testament. So maybe that's good. It's safer to have read Virgil first.
At the end of your book, you show a passage that is often quoted as the first creed in the New Testament from Paul that talks about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then you showed, I believe, a passage from the Old Testament that correlates or that shows similarities. Tell us about if you compare Paul's perspective of the cross versus all the Gospels, is there any connection, or is his so different that cannot be even compared, because he's coming from completely theological and completely revelatory version of what happened? Is that any reliable source at all, or is that something that needs to be dealt with completely separate?
Okay, let me go back now and focus on Paul. He's not really starting from a revelatory point of view. He's starting as a persecutor, he tells us. That's his own word, and actually Luke Acts agrees with him on this. The first thing he did was persecute Christians. Now, I'm not imagining that story of him being sent from Jerusalem to Damascus with rites of rendition, which we invented. There was no rendition in the first century. But Paul's a persecutor. Now, please think about that for a second. You don't persecute people until you're really angry about what they're doing and saying, which means you know what they're doing and saying. So before Paul ever had any revelation of Jesus, he was annoyed enough, infuriated enough. He talks about his zeal to persecute Christians, probably getting them tossed out of the synagogue. I doubt if you might be able to lynch a Christian, but you could certainly not execute a Christian without bringing the Romans down on you. They had the rights of execution. So I begin by emphasizing Paul knew enough about Christianity and Christ to persecute. That's where he starts. Now, the shock he has, the revelation he had, is that this Jesus is revealed to him as the Son of God. Now, if I'm trying to imagine how that actually happened, Paul was a Pharisee. Pharisees believed in the general resurrection. That's at the end of time. If he had a vision, I think he had a vision. And visions are historical events. How you interpret them is a separate issue. But if somebody tells me they have a vision and they're not liars or something like that, then yes, Luther had a vision. People have visions. How they interpret them is another question. I think Paul had a vision of Jesus. He keeps insisting, I saw him. Forget Luke with his blinding light. Luke's blinding light has blinded 2,000 years of Christian interpretation. Go to Galatians. Paul says, it was revealed to me. I saw him. He keeps mentioning saw. Because that's all that makes him equal to Peter. Peter has seen Jesus in the earthly life. Paul's probably a little bit embarrassed that he never done that. But he can insist, I am an apostle because I've seen Jesus. That's a visionary scene. And I think what he saw was Jesus, the crucified one, in glory. That's the sort of vision that makes you think, oh, so they're right. Now that's a revelation. That's a vision. I consider visions to be hardwired options of our human mind like dreams. They can change your life, but I don't think for a second there's somebody out there. But that's like a dream. You can wake up screaming from a dream. It's not an hallucination. It's an hallucination if you don't know it was vision. So Paul begins with that knowledge. Now, his emphasis, of course, cannot be on the sayings of Jesus much, because he knows that's secondhand. He had to learn that from somebody. But he also knows that he has seen the Lord. So it's based completely for Paul on a vision. That's different. For Peter and people like that, it was based on walking the roads with Jesus and then afterwards having visions.
Well, I know you have limited time, but when it all comes down to it, the key elements of history and how to use history to help us decipher ancient texts, I think that's the lesson from your book, that if we're going to use history to decipher the Iliad and all other ancient works, we should do the same for the biblical narrative, and then it helps us kind of normalize it and put it more in context with our modern experience, because I feel that people shut down modern experience and they go straight to biblical miracles and stuff like that, and then suddenly their questions are answered. But when you do the method like you're doing it, more questions develop, and it's a little more uneasy for people of faith. Is that how you would summarize it?
I'd make two preambles. Let me pick up your example. If you're trying to figure the historicity, say, of the Iliad, or, well, no, go to the Odyssey, the Iliad, if you could for a minute sort of bracket the Iliad, I think if you go through the Iliad directly, you know, it's such a magnificent piece of writing, you'll never get it. Put it aside and say, okay, it's on in the the Dardanelles Straits in the year 1200. Could there be, for example, I'm going fast, could there be a big city there on the Turkish side now, controlling the straits. Could this be about controlling the straits? And the war goes on for 10 years, as if they're there for 10 years. No, there couldn't be. It goes on for 10 years. It's the Greeks and the Trojans trying to decide who controls the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Ooh. Now, that's kind of prosaic. So let's make it about a woman. Let's make it about Helen. Much more interesting. I always get a lot of interest in there. So I find the same with Jesus. I try to kind of bracket him. I know I can't do it, but bracket him historically and say, give me as thick a description as you can of the Romanization of Israel in at least the first 30 years of the first century. Now, I know I'm doing that because of Jesus, so I know I'm kind of cheating a bit. But tell me about Antipas. Forget Jesus. What's Antipas doing in Galilee? What's he doing when he moves his capital city to the lake? Why are fishers all over the place? So try and get as thick a description you can of the time and place. Then, and only then, put your Iliad or your gospel against that. And what shows up pretty much clearly is what makes sense at that moment and what is the later development. In other words, if your text is dated from 70 or 80, that's what, 50 years maybe? So you'll have layers in there. Of course you will. You got them in the Iliad too, by the way. So the discipline would have to be to try and start with history, but don't get your history by reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Get your history somewhere else. Find out what the people in the first century are thinking about, the Jewish people. Then when Jesus fits in there, he comes across, of course, as a Jew. He really does. If I thought he didn't, if he was against his own people and was, say, a Romanizer, I would say so. I have no vested interest I have to go one way or the other. The second thing I would insist on, though, if you're interpreting Jesus as a historian, you have to say that he's making claims that are much bigger than, I think the Romans should go home. No, he's making claims about something which he calls, say, the kingdom of God or something. You're perfectly free as a historian to say, here's what he's claiming, and I think he's nuts. I think it's stupid. Of course, it's an interpretation. It's a valid interpretation. He was just a nice guy, and he wasn't saying anything, just to be nice to babies and let me tell you little stories. And then these evil people crucified him. That's rubbish. He was, quite frankly, looking for trouble. He was part of a nonviolent resistance to Romanization. 4 BCE, there was violence. 66, there was violence. In between that, multiple Jews, not just Jesus, were trying to think, how can we oppose the Romans nonviolently? How can we keep our own integrity nonviolently? That was there if Jesus had never existed. He fits into that matrix.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you for your time and for your ongoing support of our show. And like I said, your book is fascinating. And for those that want to get a copy, this is the book. And we want to just, support people who are bringing interesting things to the table. I think there's a lot of trash in the online and a lot of things that are poorly researched and not well vetted. So it's good to talk to a living academic and classic scholar who you're using the fields that have been created to be able to discern truth properly, and you are championing critical thinking and historical analysis to be able to understand things better. So again, thank you for your work.
A great pleasure, David, as always. Thank you.
Take care.